Marilyn Carter hadn't planned on coming back. She had already stepped off the bus near her daughter's place when she realized she had forgotten her blood pressure medication on the kitchen counter. Annoyed at herself, but too disciplined to skip a dose, she headed back toward her Portland apartment, climbing the stairwell with the steady pace of someone who knew her own limits. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon. Vanessa and Daniel weren't expected until later. The building itself was still, the kind of silence that usually comforted her. But the moment Marilyn unlocked her door, something tightened in her chest. The lights were on. The air felt disturbed, as if a conversation had been abruptly swallowed by the walls. Then she heard it, voices. Low, tense, pressed together like fists. Marilyn didn't move at first. She let the sound guide her, closing the door softly behind her. Her heartbeat, ordinarily controlled by medication and routine, began to stutter. She walked down the short hallway, her shoes silent on the old hardwood floor. As she reached the corner leading into the living room, the shape of the scene unfolded all at once. Howard Whitmore stood over Vanessa, one hand knotted in her daughter's hair, forcing her head back just enough to show dominance without leaving marks. His voice was a hiss, the kind that only cruel men used when they believed no one important was listening. "You will apologize," he growled, "and you will mean it." Vanessa, trembling, whispered something Marilyn couldn't hear. Across the room, Daniel stood frozen by the window. His shoulders were rigid, his eyes unfocused, as if everything inside him had shut down. He wasn't intervening. He wasn't speaking. He was simply existing there, silent, stunned, and obedient. Marilyn felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat, but she didn't gasp. She didn't rush forward. She didn't shout. Instead, with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed, she slipped her phone from her coat pocket and pressed record. She held it close to her body, capturing every second, the grip on Vanessa's hair, the strain in her daughter's neck, the blank terror in Daniel's face. A few more seconds. Enough. Marilyn stepped back, quietly, and then deliberately pushed the hallway chair with her knee. The sharp scrape against the wall pierced the room like an alarm. Howard released Vanessa instantly. When he turned, his face reset itself with mechanical precision, rage evaporating, sophistication returning, a politician preparing for an audience. "Oh, Marilyn," he said cheerfully, smoothing his shirt as though nothing had happened. "Didn't know you were home." Vanessa wiped her eyes quickly. Daniel straightened his posture, pretending he hadn't been paralyzed moments earlier. Marilyn gave them all the same look she gave strangers on the street, a soft, absent smile that revealed nothing. "I forgot my medication," she murmured. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Howard chuckled warmly, too warmly. Vanessa kept her gaze on the floor. Daniel swallowed hard. Marilyn walked past them toward the kitchen, her fingers still curled around her phone. Her expression remained controlled, but inside her mind, something cold and precise began taking shape. The seed of a plan had been planted, and it was already growing. That night, Marilyn sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator humming softly behind her. She placed her phone on the table, pressed play, and watched the video for the third time. The harsh lighting, the trembling of Vanessa's chin, Howard's commanding grip, it all unfolded with brutal clarity. And as she observed Daniel's distant, hollow stare, something settled into her bones. This was not the first time. She had suspected tension. She had sensed the discomfort. But this violence, this dominance, had roots deeper than she'd feared. Marilyn paused the video, her finger lingering on the screen. Confronting Howard outright would be foolish. He was too entrenched in Portland circles, too skilled at slipping into the persona of a gracious civic leader whenever eyes were on him. A direct accusation would only result in him twisting the narrative, perhaps even turning Daniel further against Vanessa. No, charging at him head-on was impossible. He had built his reputation on polished lies. She would dismantle him with documented truth. Marilyn closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. The thought was terrifying, yet it fit into place with a quiet inevitability. She needed the one thing that could cut through Howard's image, and she knew exactly where to find it. The next morning, she left early, bundled in her coat against the chilly Portland wind. The Municipal Archives building sat near the waterfront, a gray stone structure she had once known intimately. She still remembered the feel of the key cards, the smell of paper, the way history clung to the walls. When she stepped inside, the familiarity washed over her like a warm current. Former co-workers greeted her with surprise, then delight. She offered polite smiles, nothing more. Today was not a day for lingering conversations. She made her way down the quiet hallway to the private storage room where retired employees often kept personal boxes awaiting transfer or disposal. In the far corner, behind an old metal filing cabinet, Marilyn found what she had come for, a slim, sealed packet wrapped in aging brown paper. It bore a name written in graceful, fading ink, Eleanor Whitmore, Howard's late wife, a woman Marilyn had once liked, quiet, gentle, fading too early from her own life. The packet had been entrusted to her a decade ago, with Eleanor's soft voice whispering, "If anything happens to me, hold on to this." Marilyn broke the seal carefully. Inside, a small collection of documents waited, their weight heavier than paper. The first, a set of medical records, unmistakably clear. Howard Whitmore, infertile since adolescence, a condition impossible to misinterpret. The second, a handwritten confession, Eleanor's delicate script wavering in places. She described years of emotional abuse, humiliation, belittlement, her marriage a private cage hidden behind public charm. The third, irregular adoption papers for Daniel, signatures out of order, missing verification. Nothing criminal on the surface, but enough to undermine the myth Howard had built about the Whitmore lineage. Marilyn felt the room still around her. Here it was, the truth, quiet, devastating, unerasable. A weapon more precise than anger, more powerful than confrontation. She folded the documents gently, slid them back into the packet, and held it against her chest. The path forward had revealed itself. She would not attack Howard. She would expose him. Marilyn waited until late afternoon, when she knew Howard would be between meetings and most inclined to feel important. She dialed his number, forcing her voice into a tone so warm, so deferential, it almost felt theatrical. "Howard," she said pleasantly, "I was hoping you might stop by tomorrow. I'd love to discuss ways I could support your community initiatives." There was a pause, brief, satisfied, predictable. "Of course, Marilyn," he replied, already puffed with pride. "I'm pleased you're finally taking an interest." The next day, he arrived precisely on time, dressed as though stepping into a gala rather than an apartment, a tailored navy suit, polished shoes, a silk tie that practically announced old money superiority. He didn't knock timidly. He knocked the way a man knocks when he believes every door exists for him to enter. Marilyn greeted him with a polite smile, stepping aside as he swept past her, immediately scanning the living room with a disapproving eye. "Well," he said, clasping his hands behind his back, "if you want to be associated with the Whitmore family, presentation matters. People notice how a home reflects its owner." He walked slowly, pointing with authority at every perceived flaw. "These curtains are far too dated. Replace them with something neutral, linen perhaps. The sofa should be reupholstered. And this rug, no, absolutely not. It sends the wrong message." Marilyn poured tea while he listed his demands, one after another, as if reading from a mental script he'd practiced for years. He spoke about taste, reputation, and refinement, words he wielded like weapons. She nodded occasionally, offering gentle murmurs of agreement, never challenging him. Her silence fed his ego, encouraging him to expand his critique. You should also consider changing the lighting, he continued. Warm tones create a sense of sophistication. And shelves. Yes, you need more open shelving. People need to see you read. When she handed him his cup, he accepted it without gratitude, sipping while he continued outlining a complete redesign of her home. He didn't ask whether she wanted advice. He assumed she did, just as he assumed authority over every room he entered. To him, this was another opportunity to assert dominance. To her, it was confirmation that he was blind to the danger forming around him. Once he finally stood to leave, he placed the folded list of demands on her table, tapping it twice for emphasis. Follow these steps, he said, and you'll fit in perfectly. Marilyn smiled, walking him to the door, her posture relaxed, her expression mild. Thank you, Howard. I appreciate your guidance. He left convinced he had elevated her. The moment the door closed, Marilyn picked up the list, carried it to the sink, and struck a match. The paper curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash. Her silence had always been her armor. Now, it was her first declaration of war. Marilyn understood Portland's social ecosystem better than most. Prestige in the city didn't shift through public announcements. It moved quietly, shaped by the whispers and impressions of a few well-placed voices. And 3 women, in particular, held remarkable influence: Mrs. Davenport, Mrs. Langford, and Mrs. Holloway. They weren't politicians. They didn't sit on boards. But their opinions traveled like weather fronts through charity circles, church committees, and gallery events. If they began to question Howard Whitmore, the entire city would follow. So Marilyn visited them one by one, always with a small gift: homemade scones for Mrs. Davenport, a jar of berry jam for Mrs. Langford, a hand-stitched table runner for Mrs. Holloway. She never stayed long, just enough to sit for tea, chat politely, and let conversation drift toward the Whitmore family. Oh, I noticed something curious in an old newspaper clipping, she would say lightly, as if mentioning a quilting pattern. Howard's grandfather was listed as a machinist, but at the gala he mentioned a military lineage. Perhaps I misunderstood. The women leaned in. They always leaned in. At another visit, I heard the fundraiser had some unexpected expenses. I wonder if that's normal for events of that scale. She didn't accuse. She didn't imply wrongdoing. She simply asked, her tone filled with mild confusion. It was enough. Questions in the right places behaved like ink in water, spreading outward, tinting everything. By the time Marilyn completed her visits, tiny cracks had already begun forming in Howard's carefully curated image. Nothing dramatic, nothing direct, just the faintest scent of doubt clinging to his reputation, delicate and insidious. And doubt, she knew, could spread faster than truth. Back at the apartment, Daniel Carter began noticing small changes. Brochures on domestic abuse, financial coercion, and emotional manipulation appeared without announcement. One left casually on the kitchen counter, another tucked beside the mail basket, a third inside a drawer he rarely opened. At first, he assumed they were for Vanessa, maybe something she had brought home from a clinic or a support group. But the placement was deliberate, too deliberate. One morning, as he stood in the kitchen holding a pamphlet about controlling behavior and early warning signs, a tightness formed in his chest. The examples in the brochure were painfully familiar: restricting finances, public belittling, private intimidation, manipulating apologies, all things his father had done, openly, repeatedly, confidently, because Daniel had never considered any of it wrong. It was simply how he'd been raised. Now, with each new brochure he found, the ground beneath him shifted a little more. Was it possible his father had shaped him to accept cruelty as normal? Was it possible everything he believed about strength, respect, And family was distorted? He didn't tell Vanessa. He didn't tell Marilyn. He simply carried the brochures to his room and sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, staring at the pages that felt uncomfortably close to the truth. The seeds of doubt were taking root, quietly, steadily, just as Marilyn intended. It was nearly midnight when a soft, uneven knocking pulled Marilyn from sleep. She sat up slowly, listening. The knock came again, hesitant, trembling. When she opened her bedroom door, Vanessa stood in the hallway, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if holding her body together. Her eyes were red and swollen, her breath shaky. Can I talk to you?" she whispered. Marilyn stepped aside, guiding her gently into the room. Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. For a moment, she tried to gather herself, but the dam broke before she could speak. Sobs tore through her, raw and uncontrollable, her shoulders shaking as though her body had finally reached its limit. "I can't do this anymore," Vanessa gasped. "I can't pretend everything is fine. I thought I could handle it. I thought I just needed to be stronger, but he." Her words dissolved into another wave of tears. Marilyn sat beside her, not touching yet, giving her the space to unravel. Vanessa pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to steady her voice. "Howard made me sign 3 loans," she finally choked out. "All under my name. He said they were temporary, that he didn't want anything traced back to him because of political nonsense. I didn't understand at first, and then I couldn't say no." Marilyn's breath tightened, but she stayed silent, letting Vanessa continue. "He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd tell Daniel I was irresponsible, that I was unstable, that I wasn't ready to be a mother." She swallowed hard, her voice small. "And he said if we ever had children, he would take them from me, that he had friends who could make it happen, and that Daniel would side with him, because Daniel always sides with him." Her hands shook violently now. "He calls me stupid, useless, ungrateful. Sometimes he grabs me just to remind me who's in control. And every time I try to stand up for myself, he whispers that he'll destroy my life if I embarrass him." Marilyn felt something cold settle in her chest. She reached out, placing a steadying hand over Vanessa's trembling fingers. "You're not imagining this," Marilyn said softly. "You're not overreacting. What he's doing is wrong." Vanessa looked up, her eyes filled with a desperation that cut through Marilyn's composure. "I don't know how to leave," she whispered. "He'll ruin us." Marilyn held her gaze, speaking with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. "You will not face him alone." Vanessa broke again, collapsing into Marilyn's arms, sobbing against her shoulder. Marilyn stroked her hair gently, murmuring quiet reassurances until the young woman's breathing eased. But inside Marilyn, something shifted, something sharp, decisive, immovable. This was no longer about humiliation or arrogance. This was control, coercion, systematic exploitation. Howard Whitmore wasn't only a bully. He was a predator cloaked in respectability. And predators, Marilyn knew, cannot be confronted behind closed doors. They must be exposed, publicly, unmistakably, and with evidence that cannot be buried. As Vanessa fell asleep, exhausted beside her, Marilyn stared into the darkness. The path ahead was no longer uncertain. The confrontation would come, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Marilyn woke before dawn the next morning, long before the rest of the apartment stirred. Vanessa slept fitfully in the guest room, her breathing uneven from the night's collapse. Daniel had left early for work, leaving the space eerily quiet. It was in that rare silence that Marilyn allowed herself to think clearly, to examine every angle, every implication of what she now knew. Confronting Howard privately would accomplish nothing. He would twist the narrative, gaslight, deny, or even retaliate. But if she brought him into a room he did not control, surrounded by people whose opinions mattered to him more than truth itself. He would unravel, and his downfall would be witnessed. She sat at her kitchen table with a notepad, her pen tapping softly as she outlined the structure. The gathering needed to feel harmless, casual, supportive, even flattering. Something he would never question. She settled on the perfect pretext, a small gathering to brainstorm community support strategies for Howard's rumored civic aspirations. To make it irresistible, she would invite the women whose opinions shaped the city, Mrs. Davenport, Mrs. Langford, Mrs. Holloway. Add 2 well-connected museum donors, a retired journalist with a taste for scandal, and a local pastor who had recently praised Howard's leadership. Howard would see the invitation as validation. Daniel would come because he always did what his father expected. And once they entered that living room, surrounded by watchful eyes, Marilyn would guide the evening toward a truth Howard could not escape. She opened the sealed packet from Eleanor Whitmore again, laying out each document with meticulous care. The medical records, the handwritten confession, the adoption irregularities. She scanned and printed multiple copies, tucking each set into its own envelope addressed discreetly to key guests. Then she rehearsed. She stood in her living room and practiced the order of revelations, the tone she would use, the calm authority she needed to maintain. She visualized the moment Howard's confidence cracked, the exact second when he realized the performance he had perfected for decades could no longer save him. She practiced until her voice no longer trembled. By early afternoon, her living room was transformed into a quiet war room. Envelopes stacked neatly on the coffee table, a tray of refreshments planned, seating arranged to position Howard in full view of the people whose opinions he valued most. It was controlled, strategic, surgical, a confrontation disguised as hospitality. As the final preparations came together, Marilyn paused in front of the window, watching a thin veil of Portland rain blur the world outside. For the first time in years, she felt something awaken within her, a pulse of purpose, of clarity. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't hesitant. She was alive, and Howard Whitmore, for the first time in his life, would have nowhere to hide. Marilyn's apartment had never looked so polished. Soft lighting, carefully arranged seating, a modest spread of hors d'oeuvres. Everything chosen to create an atmosphere of ease, civility, and quiet prestige. The influential women of Portland arrived first, offering warm greetings and curious glances. They admired the decor, the view, the hospitality. Then the door opened, and Howard entered with the confidence of a man stepping onto a stage he believed he owned. Daniel followed a step behind, subdued, his eyes flicking nervously toward Vanessa. She moved carefully, almost weightlessly, as if afraid that even her footsteps might draw attention. Howard immediately began weaving himself into the conversations. He spoke about community leadership, upcoming initiatives, and the importance of maintaining moral standards in public life. His tone was authoritative, graceful, polished, decades of practice charm on full display. The guests nodded, smiled, listened. Only Marilyn noticed the tension threaded through Vanessa's posture. Only she saw how Daniel's thumbs rubbed anxiously along the rim of his glass. And only she knew how thin the walls of Howard's persona really were. As dinner was served, conversation flowed smoothly. Howard dominated the table, gesturing expansively as he recounted a story from a recent charity event. The guests laughed politely, impressed by his poise. Marilyn watched him with calm detachment. To them, he appeared confident, generous, visionary. To her, he was a man unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. The fracture came suddenly. Vanessa, carrying a bottle of Pinot Noir to refill glasses, moved too quickly. Her hand shook, just a tremor, barely perceptible, and the bottle knocked against a crystal glass. It shattered instantly. Wine splashed across the tablecloth. The room froze. Vanessa's breath caught, her face draining of color. Howard pushed back his chair, rising with a speed that startled even Marilyn. His expression hardened, voice sharp with ice. "For God's sake, Vanessa!" His arm lifted, not yet a strike, but the unmistakable beginning of one. It was instinctive, practiced, automatic. A gesture meant to intimidate, to control, to punish. Marilyn moved before anyone else could process what they were seeing. She stepped between them, calm but immovable, her posture straight and grounded. "That's enough. Howard!" Her voice was steady, not loud, not angry, just undeniable. Howard froze mid-motion, shocked, not by resistance, but by who resisted him. For a long moment, the room remained suspended in silence. The guest stared, eyes widening as understanding flickered. Daniel stood rigid, torn between fear and disbelief. Vanessa backed away, pressing a hand to her chest, trembling. Howard slowly lowered his arm, but his face had transformed. The polished charm was gone, replaced by something darker, more volatile. He glanced around, realizing too late that his private behavior had slipped into public view. Marilyn held his gaze, her expression unreadable. The first crack in his facade had formed, and every witness in the room had seen it. The silence after Howard lowered his hand stretched across the room like a drawn wire. No one moved. No one spoke. Marilyn felt the moment settle. Tense, fragile, perfect. She turned toward the guests with a composed smile, as if the evening had simply shifted into a different kind of conversation. "Since we're all here to support Howard's civic ambitions," she said gently, "I think transparency is essential. Leadership must be grounded in integrity. Wouldn't you all agree?" Mrs. Davenport nodded, unsettled but attentive. Mrs. Langford leaned forward. Howard stiffened. "Marilyn, this is hardly—" She lifted a hand, silencing him with a grace he could not counter. "I'd like to begin with something small. Financial matters, actually." She walked to the coffee table, picked up a folder, and placed it in front of Mrs. Holloway, the most meticulous of the three women. "These are copies of 3 loans taken out under Vanessa's name," Marilyn explained calmly. "All of them signed under coercion. None of them benefited her." Vanessa flinched, her hands tightening around the back of her chair. Howard's jaw twitched. "This is absurd." "Vanessa agreed," Marilyn cut in. "After repeated threats that you would take any future child from her and that Daniel would believe whatever you told him." Gasps fluttered across the room. Mrs. Davenport clutched her pearls. Daniel's face paled. Howard laughed, a brittle, cracking sound. "You're twisting things. This is a private family matter." "Then let's move to something less private," Marilyn said. Her tone remained polite, controlled, surgical. She picked up her phone, tapped the screen, and placed it on the center of the table. The video began to play. The room filled with the unmistakable image of Howard gripping Vanessa's hair, forcing her to apologize, his voice cold and commanding. Daniel appeared in the corner of the frame, frozen, helpless, complicit by silence. No one breathed. Mrs. Langford's hand flew to her mouth. The pastor stared as if witnessing a sin manifest in real time. Howard stepped forward, panicked. "Stop this, Marilyn. That video is taken out of context." "There is no context," she said quietly. "That justifies what we all just saw." Vanessa trembled, holding herself tightly. Daniel looked as though gravity itself had abandoned him. Howard's mask had cracked, but Marilyn wasn't finished. She approached the dining table, placing a thick, sealed envelope in front of Daniel. "This," she said softly, "is from your mother, Eleanor." Daniel blinked, stunned. "My mother?" "Yes," Marilyn said. "She entrusted these documents to me before she died. She wanted you to know the truth, one day when the moment was right." Howard erupted. "Marilyn, don't you dare!" But it was too late. She opened the envelope, sliding its contents into the center of the table. Eleanor's handwriting, medical records, adoption irregularities, paper evidence that spoke with the quiet force of a gavel. "Your mother suffered emotional abuse for years," Marilyn said, her voice soft but unflinching. And she also documented something else, something she knew would eventually destroy Howard's control. She tapped the medical records. "Howard is infertile, has been since adolescence, which means," she looked at Daniel with gentle clarity, "he is not your biological father." The room fractured. Daniel staggered back as if struck. No, that's—" He scanned the documents with shaking hands, eyes darting across evidence he could not deny. Howard swarmed forward, desperate. "Daniel, listen to me. None of that matters. I raised you, did you?" Daniel whispered. His body trembled with the weight of decades collapsing. "Did you ever treat me like a son? Or like something you needed to control?" Howard reached out. "Daniel!" Daniel stepped back sharply. His voice broke, not into a shout, but into a quiet, devastating truth. "You're not my father." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Howard froze, his face draining of color, stripped of authority, stripped of legacy, stripped of the one claim he believed untouchable. And the witnesses, every single one, saw him for exactly who he was. For a long, suspended moment, the room stood frozen around Daniel's words. Howard's face drained of color. His posture, once regal, commanding, buckled at the edges. He looked less like a leader and more like a man who had just watched the floor vanish beneath him. Then humiliation struck like lightning. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. The polished veneer he depended on shattered with an audible crack. "You," he hissed, turning toward Marilyn. "You orchestrated this." He lunged, not gracefully, not with intention, but with the wild, clumsy desperation of someone cornered. Several guests gasped. Vanessa stumbled back. Daniel reached out instinctively, but froze again, caught between rage and disbelief. Marilyn didn't flinch. She stood firm, her voice level and steady, the calm eye of a storm. "Howard," she said, "there are 10 witnesses in this room and multiple copies of every document. Every threat, every denial, everything you say or do right now is being observed." The words struck him harder than any physical barrier. Mrs. Davenport straightened with surprising authority. "I saw everything," she said. "So did I," Mrs. Langford added sharply. "And I," Mrs. Holloway concluded, her voice cold with finality. One by one, every guest voiced agreement. There was no ambiguity, no loyalty left to manipulate. Howard looked around, realizing the room he thought he commanded had turned into a courtroom, and he was the defendant. His mouth opened, but no excuses came. No charm, no polished spin, just a trembling breath and a face contorted by rage, shame, and disbelief. He tore his gaze away, grabbed his coat with shaking hands, and stormed out the door. The sound of it slamming echoed through the apartment like a verdict. But disgrace did not mean defeat, not for a man like Howard. In the days that followed, the Whitmore household turned into a battlefield of messages, threats, and intimidation. Howard sent Vanessa texts dripping with venom, accusing her of betrayal, of weakness, of ruining the legacy he built for her. He left Daniel voice mails demanding loyalty, insisting that blood doesn't matter, authority does. He sent Marilyn long, rambling emails accusing her of destroying a great man, warning her that she would answer for her meddling. Some messages were eerily calm, others bordered on unhinged. And then came the threats of litigation. He would sue for defamation, for emotional damages, for conspiracy. He claimed he had friends in high places who would ensure she regretted humiliating him. Marilyn read every message with a measured, almost clinical detachment. Howard's panic was loud, clumsy, and predictable. She made tea. She organized her documents. She reread Eleanor's confession. And slowly, she began preparing the one thing Howard had never expected. Her final counter. Not another confrontation. Not another gathering. Something far more precise. Something he could not silence, bend, or intimidate. Howard Whitmore had spent decades building his power through fear. Marilyn was about to take it from him. Permanently. Howard's final call came 3 days after the confrontation. Marilyn had been expecting it, not because she imagined reconciliation, but because a man like Howard Whitmore would never disappear without one last attempt to assert control. The phone rang sharply in the quiet of her apartment. She answered on the second ring, her voice level. "Marilyn," Howard began, breath tight, voice frayed at the edges. "We need to discuss what happened. You overstepped. You created a spectacle. But it isn't too late to correct this." His words carried the same old rhythm, commanding, confident, dripping with entitled expectation. A tone meant to intimidate, to pull her back into his orbit. Marilyn let a small silence settle between them before she spoke. "Howard," she replied, her voice cold enough to frost glass, "I'm not here to negotiate with you." He inhaled sharply. "You think you've won? You think you can ruin me with gossip and stage theatrics? You don't understand the circles I move in." "I understand them better than you think." Her calmness rattled him. She could hear it in the sharp hitch of his breath. "I've already filed inquiries with the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation," she continued, "regarding the coerced loans taken out in Vanessa's name." The line went dead silent. "And should you attempt to retaliate," she added, "all evidence regarding Eleanor's written confession and Daniel's adoption irregularities will be disclosed to the appropriate authorities. Every document is duplicated. Every witness is prepared to testify." Howard exhaled shakily. For the first time, there was no anger in the sound, only fear. "You don't know what you're doing," he whispered. But the conviction was gone. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Marilyn answered. "I'm telling you that the next move you make will decide whether this remains a social humiliation or becomes a legal one." Another long silence, this one different, heavy, final. When Howard finally spoke, his voice was unrecognizable, thin, wavering, a man watching the last foundations of his identity crumble beneath him. "I've lost everything," he murmured. Marilyn didn't respond. He swallowed audibly. "Portland was supposed to be mine." "It never belonged to you," she said. "Only to the image you forced others to believe." A soft exhale traveled through the line, the sound of a fight extinguished. "Goodbye, Marilyn." It wasn't surrender. It was something emptier, a man with nothing left to defend. She hung up without another word. 2 days later, Howard Whitmore left Portland. No announcement, no farewell dinner, no final performance. His house went dark, his social calendar vanished, and his name slipped quietly from the city's conversations. A man who once demanded admiration disappeared without a trace. Proof that power built on domination collapses the moment truth touches it. Daniel's breakdown came not in a dramatic burst, but in a quiet, devastating unraveling. He sat at the kitchen table one evening, elbows on his knees, hands pressed to his face. Vanessa approached hesitantly, unsure whether to comfort him or give him space. Marilyn watched from a respectful distance. "It wasn't just a lie," Daniel whispered finally. "My whole life, every belief I had about family, about loyalty, about strength, he built those things out of fear. Not love." Tears streamed freely, the kind he had swallowed for years. Vanessa knelt beside him, resting her hand gently over his. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "You don't have to be who he shaped you to be." The healing was slow, fragile, but real. Vanessa began reclaiming small pieces of herself, her voice, her confidence, her independence. Daniel began unlearning decades of conditioning, confronting the shadows of a father who had never been one. Marilyn remained present without hovering, a quiet anchor in their home. On a cool Portland morning a week later, Marilyn returned to the municipal archives. She carried the sealed packet of Eleanor's documents tucked under her arm. She walked to the same storage room where she had found it, opened the same metal cabinet, and placed the packet back into its original place. Not to hide it, not to forget it, but because it had served its purpose. Justice had been delivered, not with shouting, not with revenge, not with spectacle, but with truth. And truth, handled correctly, had a way of ending what fear had kept alive for decades. Marilyn closed the cabinet quietly. For the first time in years, her heart felt unburdened, steady, calm, resolute. Eleanor could finally rest, and so could she.